Good morning, this is Rabbi Elton from the Great Synagogue, and this is our weekly class in the Rashi, the biblical commentator from France, working in around the year 1100, and his comments on the weekly parasha. It is the most influential commentary to be written on the Torah by a rabbi in the last 2,000 years. And this year we're looking at the third Aliyah, the third Torah portion, and looking at some of Rashi's comments on these verses. So let's have a look at chapter 2, verse 2 of Bamidbar. We're now in a new book of the Torah. We're now in the book of Numbers. And the word Bamidbar means in the wilderness, and begins with a description of the arrangement of the tribes around the tabernacle when they camped in the desert as they journeyed from Egypt to the land of Israel. And Rashi in these verses is going to be interested in explaining the precise arrangement of those different tribes. So let's have a look. Chapter 2, verse 2, Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. The verse says, Ish al diglo, uva osos levesavosam, yachanu v'nei Yisrael. Each person shall camp by the degel, by the flag, and by the os, the sign of their father's house. Mineged saviv lahel moed yachanu. Arranged around at some distance from the tabernacle, that is how they should camp. Now it's interesting, there seems to be a doubling up in the start of this verse. It says, Ish al diglo uva osos. Each person shall camp by their flag and by their sign. Well, presumably the sign is the flag and the flag is the sign. So let's see what Rashi has to say about that. So he says this, Kol degel yelo os. Each flag was itself a sign, or it had a sign. Mapa tzavua tuluya bo. A piece of coloured cloth was hanging from it. Tzivo shelzer, loka tzivo shelzer. And the colour of each tribe was different. So there were simple colours, red, blue, green, purple and so on, which applied to the different tribes. And everyone was distinct from the other, so you could tell which was your sign very easily. And how do they choose the colours which would be used for each of the tribes? Tzeva kol echad kagon avno hakavua b'choshen. The high priest wore a breastplate, and on the breastplate were 12 jewels, and each jewel represented one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the colour of the jewel was used as the colour of the flag. And as a result of that, each person could recognise their own flag. Davar acher, an alternative explanation. When Rashi says davar acher, it means he's not entirely satisfied with the first explanation, therefore he should offer a second explanation. And I think that's because he's just essentially made degel and os the same. The sign and the flag are the same thing. But that's not entirely satisfactory if we want to make sure that every word in the Torah has a special and particular significance. So he says this, Ba'osos levesavosam, the signs of their father's household. Ba'oshem masa lahem Yaakov avihem. This is, in fact, not a sign in the sense of an image, but a sign in the sense of an instruction, which was given to them by their father, Keshen sa'uhu b'Mitzrayim, when they were taken out of Egypt. Shneimar, as the verse says in Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, V'yasu vanav lo kol kasher sivam. The tribes, or the sons in fact, carried out exactly according to their father's wishes, in the way that they carried his body out of Egypt and back to the land of Israel. Yudah v'Zachar u'Zvulun yisa'uhu min hamizrach. Judah and Issachar and Zavulun, they carried him from the east. Reuven v'Shimon v'Gad min hadarom. And the other tribes, the other sons of Reuven, Shimon and Gad, they were in the south. And other tribes, other brothers were of course in the other 2 points of the compass. So this is not a sign in the sense of an image, it's a sign in the sense of an instruction of how they were to arrange themselves. So degel in the second explanation refers to the flag, and os refers to the arrangement. It's the arrangement, the geographical arrangement of the tribes around the tabernacle that had been instructed by their ancestor Jacob. Mineged, so this phrase we saw, Mineged Soviv Lehel Moed, arranged at some distance around the tent of meeting, around the tabernacle. Merechot mil, it was a mil distance. A mil is 2,000 cubits. Kamo shenemar b'Yoshua, just as it says in the book of Joshua, Achrachot hieh beinechem uvanav ka'alpayim amah. He says the Israelites are about 2,000 amot, 2,000 cubits away from the tabernacle. Why was that? Sheyuchlu levo b'Shabbos, so they could go there on Shabbos. The distance that one may journey on Shabbat outside of a built-up area, let's say in the countryside, is 2,000 cubits. You can't go any further than that. That's called the tchum. That's called the Sabbath boundary. So you want some respectful distance between the tribes and the tabernacle, between the holiest place in the camp and the ordinary living quarters. You want that distance, but not so far that they can't travel in on Shabbat, because Moshe v'Aaron v'anav v'halavim chonin b'samach lo. The leaders of the people who could teach the people on Shabbat and instruct them on Shabbat lived quite close to the tabernacle. They were the furthest in, and so if you make the tabernacle 2,000 amot, 2,000 cubits from the tribes, everyone can get in at least as far to be near Moses on Shabbat, so they could learn from him. Our next verse number 3. V'achonin kedma mizracha dega machane Yehuda l'sivo sam v'nasi livnei Yehuda Nachshon ben Amminadav, and camped on the kedma. We'll see what that means. Mizracha, which means on the east side. Dega machane Yehuda. This was the flag of the camp of Judah, l'sivo sam, all of its divisions, and the prince of the Judah tribe was Nachshon ben Amminadav. He's quite well known because he's the chap who jumped into the water when it was at the Red Sea. And at that point the sea split. He's also related to Moshe. He's Miriam's son. So let's have a look at this word kedma. What does kedma mean exactly? So kedma lefanim hakruya kedem. That which is in front is called kedem. When one goes kedem, one goes in front. Ve'ezazurach mizrachis, and this is in fact the eastern direction. Why? V'marav kriya achor, and west is called behind. Why? Because the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So the east is the front, and the west is the back. So kedma mizracha is the front and also towards the east. A few verses later on, verse number 9. Kol ha'pekudim l'machane Yehuda me'as elef u'shmanim elef v'sheshesh halafim v'arba me'os l'sevesam rishona yisau. And the total census count for the camp of Judah was 186,400 for all of the different divisions, and they marched first. So Judah marched first. Judah, we know, is the kingly tribe. It's the tribe which is going to produce in perpetuity from David onwards all the kings of Israel, and that seems to be the reason why they march first. So how would it work? Rashi says this: Kisheroin ha'anan mistalek, when they saw that the cloud had lifted, when the camp was established, the cloud of glory would rest on the tabernacle, symbolizing God's presence. And when that cloud moved, or dispersed, or lifted off, that's when people knew it was the sign that they should break camp and move off. So when they saw this cloud was departing, Turkin Hakonim b'chatzotzros, the priests blew the trumpets, and then at once the camp of Judah, they moved off. And then everyone would move off in the arrangement in which they camped. Halavim v'agalos be'emtza, and the Levites and all the wagons which had the collapsed, taken apart tabernacle stored on it, would be in the middle, just as the tabernacle was in the middle of the camp. Degel Yehuda b'mizrach, the flag of Judah in the east, v'shel Ruven b'darom, and of Reuven in the south, V'shel Ephraim b'marav, and Ephraim in the west, V'shel Dan b'tzafon, and Dan in the north. So, although the tribe of Judah went first, they weren't necessarily in front, because that would depend on the direction they were travelling in. Judah is always in the east, so if they're travelling west, then Judah wouldn't be in front, but they do at least begin the process of the camp setting off. And now, a few verses later on, shows how this works again. V'nasa el moed machna halavim b'toch hamachanos kasher yachanu ken yisau ish al yado lediglehem. Then, in the middle of all of these different tribal camps, was the Ohel Moed, was the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and that's where the Levites were, and they moved off. And again it says, as they would camp, that's how they would also set off and march, everyone according to their standards. So we have the Levites in the middle, and everyone, as it were, moves around them just as they camp around them. And Rashi said, Kamoshe parashti, just as I've explained above in verse 9, Halichasan kachani yasan, the movement was the same as the camping. Kol dega ma'alech leruach hakavualo, each one of the tribes would move off, keeping its place in relationship to the tabernacle as it had when it camped. So, if we want to link this back to the first Rashi we saw, when Yaakov told his descendants that this is the way you have to camp, there's obviously a deep significance to that, because it's not as though when they break camp and they start to move off, everyone just sort of forms a long line, or even that Judah goes first because he's the senior tribe, he's the kingly tribe. That seems not to be the case. The geographical arrangement of who is in the north, south, east and west is so important, the whole camp moves like that. And in fact, the camp would look the same whether it was stationary, whether it was moving. Everyone would be in the same position relative to each other, and it would just be on the move. And then it would stop, and people just, I suppose, camp wherever they happen to stop. They would only need to rearrange themselves wherever they stopped. That's where they would pitch camp. That would have made things rather easier and more straightforward, but also preserves the integrity of the camp and the arrangement which was set by Yaakov on his deathbed and was first carried out by his own sons when they took his bones to Egypt, when he took his bones to the land of Israel. So that was a trial run, as it were. Instead of the tabernacle in the centre of the camp, you have the coffin of Jacob in the centre of his sons, and then that is then replayed centuries later when you have a much greater number of people and the Ohel Moed, the tabernacle in the middle, and all of the tribes arranged around, but essentially carrying on the same journey and in the same arrangement as was presaged by their ancestors, the founders of the tribes. Everyone have a good and healthy week. Please God, we should hear more good news here in Australia, and we should see healing across the whole world. Everyone, God bless.